twentyonepilots released the final music video of the Lore City Walls back on September 12th. It's a long music video. There's a lot that happens in it, story-wise and lore-wise, and there's a lot to unpack in the main bulk of the video itself, which I've already taken a stab at doing a couple of times. And I think there's some more stuff even to take implications from and consider and look at from the music video itself. But I noticed in the end credits of the music video, there are a number of different concept drawings and diagrams and things like that, which at first glance are really cool to see, because it's just cool to see all that behind the scenes thing, as we've talked about in the past. It would be really cool to get a a lore documentary of building out the story and filming all these music videos and everything like that and creating all of this. And so in a sort of similar fashion, it's really cool to see drawings and diagrams in the end credits of the music video that aren't just related to this music video, but related to the story as a whole. I mean, the end credits really were credits, obviously, for the entire story, not just City Walls. But there's one page in particular in the end credits that seemed to be more than just cool concept drawings and concept art, although that certainly was part of it. Plans and maps for how they're going to film music videos and the story and stuff like that, but also concept art that has clues which seem to tell us more than what we were told in the videos. And I will just say right off the bat, I'm not sure I can fully claim to understand where this then takes us when looking at these clues and looking back at the story as a whole. But it does raise some interesting questions. With that said, let's take a look at this one particular page. And apologies, it's a little dark. In order to kind of get a screen grab that captured the most of what was on this page, I had to wait until it started to fade to black and then into the next page, right? So it's starting to get a little dark, but there's a number of different drawings packed into this one page, obviously. And so there's some really cool things, like just kind of a diagram of this main tower, Resdro's tower here, and kind of showing, these figures in the bottom of the tower. Probably this is, where one of the bishop's ceremonies would be taking place, something like we saw in Nico and the Niners. You can see almost a little, a bucket or cauldron, like we see in that video. They're kind of assembled around doing their practices. And then this seems to just be kind of a map of the towers as they sit and the lights hitting them and forming the circles, sort of like we see on the cover of Blurryface. So that's cool. Then we've got some concept art for the bishop, some early designs, character designs for how they would look. This is very Lord of the Rings coded, if you will, in look, right? It reminds me of some illustrations of Tolkien's characters and things like that. Almost, I don't know, I could see Faramir wearing something like this, right? So I'm glad they kind of steered a bit away from that, whether or not it was actually inspired by Lord of the Rings to make them in this particular way, but I like what they ended up doing with the bishops. But this is very interesting design as well. And then, concept of the statue. This is basically exactly what we saw in the videos. What's the significance of the statue? I mean, I think a statue, that is a good question. Might warrant a video really just diving into what's going on with the statue as a whole. I've always seen it as kind of a symbol, the logo, as it were, the statue of vialism, where it's this concept of a human who's completed kind of by himself and finds completion within himself rather than something higher, rather than looking to something higher. I don't know. It definitely warrants a kind of a further examination, but the way the hands kind of create an unbroken cycle, right? And it's all very just self-contained. And then this idea that, not to wax philosophical, but the idea obviously behind vialism is that the way to achieve purpose and happiness in your life is by taking your own life, to put it bluntly, right? To sacrifice yourself as a glorious gone to the religion of vialism. And there's this idea, there's this like philosophical concept as well. And I first encountered it in a book, and I'm not remembering the author's name, so I don't want to mistakenly attribute it to the wrong person. But there's this idea, this concept that the ultimate form of self-reliance in an unhealthy extent is to take your own life, right? And so this idea that, again, as we kind of see throughout the story, Clancy very much relies on others to help him win this fight or help him through the cycle. People like the Torchbearer and the Banditos. And it is when he stops relying on them and chooses to take matters into his own hands and not wait for them that he fails. And that sort of is what this statue speaks to me. That concept of complete self-reliance, not looking to a higher power, but looking up at your own hands and looking at what you yourself can achieve. And look, there is some benefit to thinking, okay, what can I do, and having self-agency, right? I'm not saying the story is going against that. But there also is a sense in which an utter self-reliance can lead you down a road like this. So anyway, these are interesting ideas, or interesting pieces of concept art found among the pages, but this wasn't really the main point of what I wanted to look at here. There's two other main things. There's this map here, and all this stuff. All of this. A lot of stuff over there. We'll start with the map first. Save that for later. The map mainly is just really interesting, and it seems to me to be kind of a map of what's going on in that first escape attempt, from Heavy Dirty Soul through Jumpsuit into, I suppose, back, into Jumpsuit, back to being kind of taken back to the city before Nico and the Niners. So we have the city of Dima here. And this is kind of interesting, this quote bubble, this speech bubble with quotes, "East is up." East is up. So it isn't so much like we've seen it on maps and on the notes from Clancy and things like that. It isn't a direction of East is up. Here's a pointer for you. East is up. It's more, this is what presumably Clancy or the citizens of Dima seem to think, or what they're saying. They're saying East is up, right? It's a statement rather than a fact. And then we have this road, a couple of different points. I'd be somewhat curious to know if each of these points, something was supposed to happen in a music video or were supposed to represent a series of music videos. Maybe these are kind of points that each cycle he gets to, right? This could be a metaphorical rather than a literal map. And then the road ends with the place you want to be. And then this arrow may not arrive. Which could be, depending on when this was written, an early indication that Clancy wasn't going to make it out in the cycle. He might not get there. And also just kind of this idea of the place you want to be. Well, what is that, right? That isn't a literal geographical place that we see in the lore. Unless it's just Trench more broadly, but anything beyond Dima, it seems, is Trench. So it seems like this road's going through Trench to the place you want to be. And there's a sense in which he has to navigate through Trench and even go beyond Trench and get to the place you want to be. And that could be the cliffs overlooking the Paladin Strait that we see him playing on in that music video. Right. And then we have these notes here. The road is windy during the day, perfectly still at night, and both are unnerving. And then we have this interesting timestamp, 2918, I think it is. I don't know if that's supposed to be associated with, a point in time when we put all the music videos together into one long narrative, or if it's supposed to be a date, or if it's supposed to be, what. It doesn't, unless it's 24, but even that doesn't really make sense because there's no 2419 on a 24-hour clock. It doesn't really seem to be a time in terms of hour and minutes. It's probably minutes and seconds, right? If it's a time, maybe it's something else. And then this little thing, pine needles on the road. Cool detail. I don't think we saw pine needles on the road, but maybe next to the road. Again, kind of a cool concept art thing. Let me it almost seems like these are dots as well, but even just counting these, how many dots are here? Right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's interesting. And then, kind of the 10th place is the place where you want to be. So that's interesting. Cool piece of kind of concept art, music video design, story design. So this is the next part of all of this that I wanted to talk about. And really the main thing that I wanted to focus on. I have more questions than I have answers, but there's a couple of interesting things to take note of here. First of all, this represents one of the districts inside the city. But when we look at the maps of Dima, around the towers and the circles, they have these sort of residential blocks. And this is Nico's district. And what's really interesting here, and again, this could simply be because it's an early iteration of the concept art, or it could be saying something else. What's really interesting is that Tyler lives in Nico's district. So the Clancy that we see throughout the story, the one who we get the letters from, at least, the letters in the journal from, always lives in Keon's district. And Nico's the lead bishop. Now, he does have a district, it's true. But the Clancy that we see never mentions living in Nico's district, it's always Keon's. So either this is an abandoned idea, in which case, if it's so wholly abandoned that it's just not true in the story, why would they leave it on a page like this? Or it's pointed us to the idea of Tyler maybe later taking on the name Clancy in terms of he wanted his character to be called Clancy, or Tyler existing as someone separate from Clancy, or an earlier iteration who then later names himself Clancy, existing in Nico's district. And again, this comes down to that difference that I highlighted time and again with some of my theories leading up to the release of Breach. This idea that there really seems to be two characters at play here, two main characters. One who lives and is governed directly by Keon's, and one who lives in and is governed directly by Nico or Blurryface. Because in the journal, in the letters, in the story told from that perspective, which closely follows the story told in the music videos, in the letters, the written form, Clancy is governed by Keon's. But in the music videos, and not in the letters, Clancy seems to be governed, or at the very least is brought back into Dima by Nico. The only exception being that we do see the script for the I'm Clancy video at the end of Clancy's journal, which talks about how Nico brings him back instead of Keon's. So there's a discrepancy there, and then we also see this. And this is the first time really in the written form of things, but again, this is concept rather than something that's supposed to be written by Clancy in his journal, that we see this idea of the main character existing and living in Nico's district rather than Keon's. So that's cool, right? This little part of the puzzle. But then what's going on here? Because this at first I was like, oh, this is cool, right? We kind of see the towers mapped out with the different numbers. And then we see the names corresponding, right? That's cool. But the problem here is, and I don't unfortunately have the list pulled up, but I know a couple off the top of my head. These numbers don't map up to this diagram here. So unless this diagram is flipped on its side, or this diagram is flipped on its side, neither of which really would make sense because everything else is pointing up, with east being up. Why would this one be the only one that's rotated? Why is there a discrepancy between these two? Now, as we can see here, this is the violation code that was given to the Clancy who we followed this entire story. I remember it first appearing in the Trench era. Obviously, you are in violation, failed perimeter escape, violation code, and then this is the number. Then it appeared on the Trench CD. It appeared on Clancy's shirt. It's very closely connected to Clancy, and that maps on to what we see here, right? 153 986 42 14. Reading left to right and going through the rows, just as you would normally read. This maps onto that perfectly. But these numbers don't map onto this. Resdro's the same, right? He's still in the middle in 8. He seems to always be the center tower, no matter what. But this 1 here, track 1, the number 1, is associated with Keon's. And here on the diagram we see Andre. Similar thing here. 4, fairly local, is the song associated with Andre, but here we have either Nico or Nils. 5 is Scavenger, and we see that over here associated with 6 instead, and so on. Now, I don't remember all these exactly. I think Fisto might be 3, something like that. But again, Keon's is 1 over here on the 3, right? This does not map onto this. These don't equal each other. But then we look down here, and we see 3 more sets of violation codes. And it's the second one, the one associated with North, that maps on to this diagram here, right? 4 for Andre, 9 for Lisden, I think is right, for Polarize. Keon's is 1, right? Nico is associated with Stressed Out, so that'll be 2. Restro from Doubt, right? Track 8. Scavenger 5. Nils from Goner, 14. 6 for Lame Boy, and 3 for Ride, right? So this diagram isn't associated with the code that we're used to, the code that we know. It's associated with this other code, this North code. So then we have these 2 other rows of numbers, right? West and south. So obviously the immediate interpretation here is that each of these represent an attempted escapee. This most recent one being the one that we followed. And then there's a couple of other ones laid out here, which would imply that he was only the fourth attempt, which maybe that makes sense. Maybe it doesn't, right? It certainly wasn't my interpretation, but that doesn't mean it's false. That couldn't be the case. And that then each of these kind of, tested each of the other ways out. And then finally, altogether, they collectively determined, okay, none of these ways out worked. So east is up. East is the way out of the city. It's the farthest he breached, but he still didn't quite make it out, right? Which then raises the question, okay, well, none of these directions worked. Which way is the way out? Right? And also kind of on that note, it wouldn't necessarily have to be the case that there have been only 4 attempts. It's just they've only successfully achieved it far enough, made it out, to be able to say, okay, this way definitely isn't the way to go. We can cross that one off the list. Let's try another one. But certainly the violation codes seem to be something that would be designated to each individual. And it wouldn't really be repeated from one individual to the next. But it could be these are the 4 Clancy's that made it the farthest for each of these directions. And so the one we see here is the one who made it the farthest, attempting to escape eastward. I'm not really sure where to go next with this. Unfortunately, don't really have an answer to this. I just think it's really interesting and no one's really talking about it. That doesn't mean there's anything actually to unpack or decode from this. It isn't necessarily a puzzle for us to solve, but I think it is interesting to kind of look at and understand this in terms of the implications that has for the story as a whole, and how that really, in my mind, seems to reiterate this idea that the Clancy who just tried was working with all this prior knowledge from all these previous Clancy's. And that's why we have Clancy's journal. That's why we have all these scraps. That's why we have the digital remains. That's why we have all these different pieces of information that's kind of, parts of it are corrupted and they're found and they're hidden, right? All of this stuff gathered together by the Torchbearer and the Banditos, presumably, and gathered together as clues, as evidence left for the future versions of Clancy to use in order to escape. And, that relates to the song Dragpath, as I talked about in my video about Dragpath. So anyway, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. If you think there is a direction it definitely does go from this, or if you think there are other implications for the story from this that I haven't realized, let me know. That seems to be the clearest answer I have for why these numbers exist the way that they do. The most obvious answer, certainly. But that doesn't mean there couldn't be other solutions and other interpretations as well. And nonetheless, at the end of the day, even if it doesn't lead us anywhere else, I think it's very interesting to see this part, this kind of glimpse into the concept of the story that includes something like this, which seems to not just be a cool piece of the history of telling the story, bit of behind the scenes imagery, but something that really can inform how we look at and interpret the story as a whole.